Hey, dear learner, I'm Mrs. K, and today we are going to discuss how to prepare and answer a poem essay successfully. This is the first video in the poetry series, so please ensure that you do have a look at all the videos that are coming out. The summer school video on the structure of the NSC exam for paper 2 is already uploaded, so please feel free to view that. Right, let's jump in. Now, what is a poem essay? Now, a poem essay is the analysis of a scene poem which you have done in class, hopefully. There are a few concepts that you need to know and memorize to be able to answer this question successfully. It is much easier to score marks in this question than in the short contextual poetry questions. Try to get at least 200 words written down for this essay. Now remember, in your NSC exam, you will have to answer 2 scene poem questions. So if you are willing to do the poem essay, you can score a lot of marks. Now, how do we prepare for this exam? Well, firstly, you have to summarize all the elements that might be asked in the poem essay so that you have all the information of each poem on one double page. This helps you to concentrate on the analysis of the poem, even for contextual questions, and it is a great way to study for the exam. The concepts that you need to know of any of the poems are the tone of the poem and whether that changes throughout the poem, the choice of words or the diction, the imagery that is found, the title and whether that's relevant to the content or the message of the poem, the style, or sometimes called the form of the poem, the message or the theme, and of course we look at punctuation. Now please note that we ask a combination of these elements when setting up your papers. Normally there should be no more than 3 elements that you need to discuss. If there are only 2 elements, it means that you need to go very deep into your analysis on each of those 2 points. Right, so I'm going to go through each of these elements to show you what do they mean, what are we looking for. And these concepts are repeated in your unseen poetry. So when you want to study your unseen poetry, or just revise your work for the exam, you can ask yourself, all right, what is the tone of this poem? And try and identify it, and so on. Right, let's have a look. Right, now, the one concept that we're going to look at is tone. Remember, tone is the way that the writer or author or speaker feels when they are writing down the words. And your job is going to be to figure out what feeling is expressed here. Now, I've given you some ideas. Maybe it's nostalgic, regretful, joyful, and so on. The opposite of that, or the big brother of that, is the word mood. Now, please note, in poetry, you will have to discuss tone, but I'm adding mood here because very often in comprehensions, in our novels and dramas, the word mood comes up, and you have to know it looks exactly the same as tone. The difference is you have to identify what feeling is created in the reader versus the emotion that wants to be expressed by the writer, author, or speaker. And this you can figure out by asking yourself, all right, how does this make me feel when I read? And remember, it's an academic discussion. It is not a personal opinion. So whenever you answer literary questions, you want to ensure that you think from an academic standpoint. Now, diction forms the largest part of any poem, and therefore the discussion can also be quite vast. Because, hello, a poem is made out of a choice of words. The poet selects specific words for specific reasons. Slang, colloquialism, dialect, and register all work together. When something is slang, it means that the expressions are created by a specific culture or social group, and they are very often used in society. For example, you can say, "Hey, what's up, brew?" And that brew will become part of the dialect of the country. Now, please note that colloquialism is a form of slang that is even more informal than slang. And very often, colloquialism is used by the people of the specific country or area, and this very often establishes where the poem is set, the geographic region, or when it is set, the historic era. And these informal words make your poem or your literary work very authentic. It makes you feel like you're there. When we look at dialect, dialect is a form of English that is spoken with a different accent. So, for example, if you come from Gauteng, up here people round their words. But in the Cape, a very flat sort of English is spoken, where the vowel sounds are flattened. And that tells you where or by who the specific English is used. Now remember, when I add words like braai or ash, that is slang, but it's more specifically colloquialism, because people of this country would understand what that means. Dialect will be more in the form of the spelling or the punctuation that is used. So have a look out for that, because your dialect and punctuation very often coincide in your poem. Lastly, register. Now, slang, colloquialism, and very often dialect form part of your informal or very informal register. Register tells us what level of formality is used in the language. Now, when you use formal register, that is found in your business documents. When you address someone that is of high standing, for example, you can say, "Good morning, Mr. President. We appreciate your visit." But when you're using informal register to talk to a classmate, you'll say, "Hey, what's up? It's awesome that you could chill with us today." Do you see the difference? Now, these are all discussion points when it comes to the poem essay. And what's very important when you're discussing diction, you have to quote words from the poem. And please ensure that they are accurately quoted. And remember that you have to write them into a sentence. And I'll show you how we do that when I show you the example in the later slides. Right, let's go to the next point. Now, images are created by using figures of speech. It is very important that you, number one, study your figures of speech and then apply the knowledge that you have gained from studying your figures of speech. Remember, a figure of speech is the image that is created by using expressions or comparisons or contradictions or sound devices. You must be able to identify them, even if you forget some of your notes that you've studied. If you know your figures of speech, you can figure it out. And more importantly, the figures of speech are used to identify elements in the unseen poetry. Now, there are 5 categories I'd like you to focus on. Number 1 are comparisons. You want to look at your similes, personification, metaphor. Now, please note, I'm just giving you a very brief overview because this is part of our revision that we do. Should you not know what they are, you must go back and revise all your work. And the more you revise your work, the easier it will become to recall the information. Remember, your brain is a muscle, and you are running this exam marathon. No one trains the night before, correct? So why do we study the night before? English, and specifically concepts like figures of speech, should be a continuous practice that you do, like weight training, so that your muscle, aka your brain, becomes stronger in recalling the information. My apologies, let's get back to our elements. The second element that you must know is the concept of contradictions. Things like your oxymorons, irony, and sarcasm. The third thing we look at is sound devices. You must know what alliteration is, sibilance, the repetition of the S sound, and onomatopoeia. You must be able to identify them. Now please note, should you quote an example of alliteration or any of your sound devices, you must underline what the alliteration is. So say for example, the W sound has been used. You must then write out the line and underline the W's. You must also in words state the W sound has been used to emphasize blah blah blah, whatever the analysis is. Please remember to do this because otherwise your identification of your sound device is not valid. Then we move over to our understatements and exaggerations. There is a whole list. You need to revise them. Remember things like your hyperbole, litotes. They come up very much in grade 11 and 12 especially. Ensure that you know what they are. And then we have a category that is called others. This is not very specific and allows for the other things like puns to be included in your figures of speech. Remember there's a subcategory here that's not a figure of speech but is called poetic devices. When you look at poetic devices, it can include things like rhyme and rhythm as well as enjambment. Using poetic devices enhances the imagery. Right, so moving on from there, remember that the image can create a picture, and this picture is what the poet is trying to convey to us as the readers. Ensure that number one, you can identify the figure, give it its name. Number two, that you can explain both the denotation, the dictionary definition of the words or expression, or the connotation, the connection that we make to the word of the figure of speech. Ensure that you can then, after you've done this, relate it back to the overall message of the poem or the question that has been asked. Now each poem has a title. When you look at analyzing the title, ensure that you ask yourself the following questions. Number one, does the title give the reader some insight into the content of the poem? Two, does it add to the message or the theme of the poem? Now, if the answer is yes, it is your job to then discuss by asking yourself why or how. How or why does it add to the content? How or why does it add to the message of the theme? The answer of that is the analysis of your title. Now, when we look at the style of writing, or in other words, the form of the poem, it very often adds to the poetic devices that are used in the poem. Sometimes the lines are long or short, and this indicates fast or slow movement in the poem as you read it. Now, the poet uses this to emphasize what is happening in the content of the poem. In Moto que Moto, the poem uses indent to show that there are different speakers. It also emphasizes that there's a separation between the different parts of the prison. Maybe even it could emphasize that the separation of the inmate from the rest of the world or just the prison. And it also shows that these prisoners uplifted one another to ensure that they all survive the prison incarceration. Now, one of the reasons that poetry is created is definitely to show or express a feeling about a topic that the poet is passionate about. When we look at the theme or the message, you need to remember, see if you can identify the topic. For example, love. Then ask yourself, what about love is the poet trying to say? The answer to that question is, of course, your theme. When you're discussing the theme, remember to also go back and see if it changes throughout the poem. Now, punctuation might seem like it's not important, but sometimes something as small as a full stop can create a soft yet powerful emphasis on a certain part of the poem or even the message the poet is trying to convey. Punctuation is either used correctly or incorrectly to further the idea of the poem. Punctuation used to abbreviate words, create their accent, dialect, or even colloquialism. It can also indicate the level of language that is used, which creates, of course, informal or formal register. The lack of capital letters can ensure that the message is emphasized. Commas can create flow in the poem, especially when used at the end of a line. Hyphens can create a new word and a compound idea. It is very important that you understand your punctuation rules and apply the knowledge that you have to ensure that you can write a well-argued paragraph. Now let's get to how do you study for your poetry, especially the poem essay. Now here is an example to show you what I would do before I prep for the exam, or not before, while I prep for the exam. Number one, ensure that you have summarized your poem into the categories. Remember to check the list on the previous slides and use a poem. Choose any poem and do this with me. Not all of the poems will have these elements, so only summarize the ones you have done in class. If you require any other notes, please click on the link of Mind the Gap at the end of this PowerPoint, and it will aid you to have some extra notes that you might not have or that will just refresh what you've learned in class. Now, if I look at the screen, you'll notice at the top or in the middle, I normally place the poem's name. Then I use tone, diction, imagery, title, style, and I color in this picture. Now what I do is I will go find, say for example, the Zulu girl. Then I will ask myself, or I'd look at my notes, what is the tone? Write it down. Anything that I need to notice about diction? Is there any dialect used? What about the register? Any colloquialisms? Slang? Then I'll move over to imagery. Now in Zulu girl there's a lot of imagery that you can discuss. And then write down the prominent ones that come up. What about the title? Does it impact on the poem? Write down the answer. Look at the style and the format. Is there something specific that I need to take note of when I look at the style of the poem? And then, of course, there are a few others or subcategories that you can use here. But the more that you write down the notes and the summary of the poem, the easier it's going to be to answer your poem essay question. Now here is the example of the question that you could expect in the NSC exam. This example is from the 27 NSC English Paper 2 exam. There are a few things to take note of here. Number one, look at the poem being assessed. It is the Zulu girl. You should already start recalling information you know about the Zulu girl if you're a grade 12 learner. Number two, notice that at the bottom of the poem is the question that you need to analyze in your poem essay. Number three, there's a few things to take note of here. Firstly, in your discussion, you must have a paragraph on diction, another paragraph on imagery, and a third paragraph discussing the tone. Secondly, you must discuss the theme of endurance and hope for the future. You use these three elements to prove the endurance, and the hope of the poem. Now let's have a look at how to get this done. Now, just like a lit essay, you have to have a clear layout of your essay. Firstly, you're going to start with an introduction that includes a general statement and a thesis statement. Paragraph 2, 3, and 4 are the body of your essay. You're going to discuss each of the elements in the order that they were mentioned in the previous slide and question. Paragraph 2 is going to be about diction. Paragraph 3, the imagery used. And paragraph 4, I'm going to discuss the tone. I'm going to end my essay with a well-structured conclusion. Now let's go into each of these so that I can show you how to write this and what to expect. In the introductory paragraph, you have to do two things. Firstly, introduce the poem and the poet in the sentence that captures the essence of the poem. For example, in the poem, comma, quotation marks, the Zulu girl, close quotation marks, the poet Roy Campbell explores the harsh working environment of a young Zulu mother as she takes care of her infant while she works. Do you see? We just restate what we already know. Remember to use double inverted commas to indicate that it is the title of the poem. Also remember to name the poet in your general statement. After that, make a statement that summarizes what the poem is about, as we've done in our example. Now that you've done your general statement, let's move over to a thesis statement. This will be the base on which you build your essay. So remember to first do your planning of the 3 paragraphs before you even write your thesis statement. Here is an example of a thesis statement, specifically for the question at the top. Through the use of vivid imagery, strong choice of words, and tone that expresses sympathy and admiration for the Zulu girl, comma, the poet creates an image of endurance through hardship that creates a sense of hope for the future of the Zulu tribe. Now, in each of your paragraphs, you will show the marker how the poet has done this, my thesis statement, by providing evidence and further analysis. Right, I hope that helps a little bit. Let's go over to the body paragraphs. In the body of your essay, which forms the largest part of your essay, you are going to show the examiner whether you can select aspects of your prescribed poem and use those aspects to formulate a persuasive and well-motivated argument in response to a topic. Here, you must use either the Peel method, the SIR method, or the C method. They're all the same. Ensure that you only discuss one element in each paragraph, and please ensure that they are in the same order as the topic on your question paper. You need to have 3 examples of evidence when discussing imagery. In other words, you must make reference to at least 3 comparisons or 3 sound devices or any other figure of speech that creates an image that supports the concept of hope for the future. Now, it's very important that even though there are many examples you can use, it has to go back to what I'm trying to prove. So write down 3 or 4 examples for each of the things you're discussing and ask yourself, which of these 3 are the strongest evidence? I always think about it like this. A literature essay and a poem essay is almost like a body that's lying on the ground. You are the investigating officer and you need to build a case. Why this person has died and if someone killed them. Now, you need to gather evidence, and that evidence needs to prove without a shadow of a doubt that this person was murdered. Now, if you look at your essay, the same applies. You are trying to prove beyond a shadow of doubt that you understand the poem and that you've studied what the analysis is. And you use that evidence to win over your marker, aka the jury. Now, for any sort of diction discussions, remember you have to quote at least, and I say quote because it's very important, 5 words to support your answer or your analysis. For the tone, you only need about 3 examples, and tone is very often indicated through the words that we have in our text, because as you know, every word has a different connotation, connection that we make, and that causes the tone in which something is read. Now, the conclusion can take many forms. In your conclusion, you can emphasize crucial ideas, raise questions about the poem, or connect the poem to possibly other works or experiences. But for school level, it is important to remember that this is the last statement you will make in support of the thesis sentence that you wrote at the beginning of your essay. In this paragraph, you must summarize in your own new words without analyzing something else, what has been proven in each of the body paragraphs. What I mean by that is use synonyms to summarize each of your paragraphs in the order in which you wrote them. But don't bring in new information into this paragraph because it will confuse the marker. Stick with what you've written and then cement that information in the conclusion. Now, before we look at the memo that was used to mark the poem essay, here are some do's and don'ts. Firstly, please remember that both your lit essay and your poem essay must be written in simple present tense. By using words that end, not words, but verbs specifically that end on an S. This analysis is a formal document and not a personal opinion. So please avoid using personal pronouns like I, we, or us. If you truly must, use the following idea. It is clear that blah blah blah, or it becomes evident that blah blah blah, rather than saying we can see that or I think it clearly shows. Avoid doing line by line analysis, as this might cause you to miss the topic completely and then your analysis is skewed. Rather choose specific examples that will support your paragraph, like imagery. What you must, however, do is use the examples in the order as they appear in the poem. Now, here's the memo that was used to mark the Zulu girl. Have a look through it and see whether or not you would have been able to answer this poem essay successfully. That wraps up our poem essay lesson. Remember to check out how to study and tackle your literature paper in the previous summer school video. In our next video, we will look at how to study and answer unseen poetry. This is Mrs. K, and I'll see you soon, sweethearts.